Alright, she's complete. This S23 Soviet 152 is all done. Build portion is done. It's, like I said in my the last segment, it's some parts fit together fantastic, some parts not so good. Alright, so a couple of different techniques you can use on painting. You can pre-shade this, or you can just go throw the base color on and have at her. You can prime it. Some guys like to prime it, then paint it. Then for me, that's just, it's too many layers of paint. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go from here a clean, ready to go kit. We're going to be using Vallejo Surface Primer. And what I'm going to do here is the bottom hull is going to be completely black. And everything coming up, we're just going to pre-shade panel lines and whatnot. I like to paint the running gear all black. I'll leave the fenders off because I'll paint the running gear all black, paint the undersides of the fenders black, let that cure, shoot some green on it, throw some mud on it, and then put the tracks on, then put the fenders on, and then work my way bottom top in finishing. So we're going to basically break this out into a separate video, I think, guys, and we'll show you how I paint. I know a lot of guys I've seen on the web, for whatever reason, throw a thick, heavy primer on, then a thick, heavy pre-shading on, and then their color, then their weathering, and you've got as many as, you know, 5 or 6 heavy coats of paint on. A little unnecessary. You want to keep these fine details popping out. So we're going to get the surface primer going. Like I said, we're going to use the Vallejo Surface Primer, and I'm also going to thin this down a bit with the Vallejo Airbrush Thinner, probably about 70-30 paint to thinner. It just flows a little bit better, and you have less chance of getting a rough, gritty surface on your model if you thin it out a bit. So I'm using the Iwata. You can mix right in the cup. I used to always mix into a little paint, not a paint, a little film canister and pour it in, but that's just a little bit, you know, you tend to waste a little bit more paint. Make sure you mix it off good. I've started using these El Cheapo Testers brushes for mixing paints and stuff. They're a good brush for that kind of stuff, guys. Don't worry about that. Now, ventilation, yes. Either a mask or a vent fan. I usually throw a mask on and some rubber gloves when you're painting, because you just don't need these chemicals in your hands and into your skin. Okay, now the beauty of doing this is two things. It gives you a primer for the paint to adhere to better, and it gives you a really nice shading that if you do miss something with your color afterwards, it's going to be covered. You're not going to be worried about it, especially in the running gear. Also on a piece of armor, guess what? All your road wheels are now painted. All the rubber's painted. You don't have to go back in and worry about that after. There's a couple things you can do. You can just freehand the green paint right in there, and you'll get a little bit of overspray. Or I've got a template, a circle template, that'll just pick out the right size and then just shoot the color right into the road wheels and be done with it. And with the amount of weathering this one's going to get, it's not going to worry about it, because trust me, when this one's done, you're not going to be seeing too much color on these road wheels anyway. So, priming, pre-shading, done in one step using Vallejo Black Surface Primer. You can also use a red, brown, or you can even use a green. They do a Russian green in the very same color. It does the same thing, but using the black gives you your pre-shade and gives you your tires all done and ready to go. The primer's all pretty much dry on this beast, so as you can see, the thinned down Vallejo primer goes on really nice and smooth velvety texture, nice coverage. So I was talking about using a template. This is the Statler metric circles template, and just throw a little bit of masking tape on one. Find the one that matches up the best. This one happens to be 28 mil. You see how well I can do this one-handed. Just stop being a lazy ass and go get the tripod. And then you basically just hold it right over, shoot the middle of your hub, boom, paint and rubber. Boom, paint and rubber. So just be real careful when you're painting the back section. And remember, you don't have to get 100% coverage on this. That's the whole point of the black, is just it adds shading, and this is going to be schmegged up with heavy mud. So we'll get some paint going here right, Chicken Louie. I'm using Vallejo Model Air number 17 Russian Green, which I thought was on my bench. Let me go find it. Well, I couldn't see the damn thing because my hand was blocking. It's right there. Vallejo Model 17, and we'll thin it down with just a little bit of airbrush, not the airbrush cleaner, the airbrush thinner, which is this is a new product from Vallejo. Works really good. They used to have that heavier cream type thinner, which I use for their brush with their when I'm painting figures, but use the airbrush thinner for this stuff. It just makes it flow a little nicer and goes on a little smoother. Alright, I'm not sure how this is coming out. These colors are in the lighting may not be strong enough to bring the colors out, but as you can see, all those road wheels are done, and it took like 10-15 a minute, quite literally a minute, and we've got nice clearly differentiated road wheels from the rubber. Now when you're doing this with the black primer, guys, don't do a heavy coat of green over top of it. Almost model it, give it a high, where there's going to be a shadow, go easier on the green. Where it's a little higher, go a little heavier on the green, get a little bit more color. I'm not a big fan of color modulation, but you can get some depth and real depth to your models just by varying the thickness and the color density of your base paint over top your black. That really does help along the way when you're weathering. So the Vallejo paints had a few hours to cure up and harden off. Now anybody who's used Vallejo paints knows three things. They spray nice, they're a nice satin sheen, they cover fairly good, but they are so soft and so delicate that they will chip and scrape and scratch off with a harsh word. So before we start fitting the tracks and start doing anything else to this, we want to give this a shot of Future. It's not called Future anymore. I think it's called Pledge with Future Shine or something. I've had this for 6 years, maybe 7 years. Little goes a long ways. So I always thin mine. I know a lot of guys have good results shooting their Future right out of the bottle. Not so much with me. I always get a pebbly surface with this. So I'm going to mix it with just a little bit of Windex, about 50-50, give it a couple of nice light coats of Future, and then we'll be able to mount some tracks on this. The Future's cured, now it's time to do some mud. Now there's a few different ways to do mud. There's pigments, there's lots of different methods. I'm going to use pigments because that's what I've got. First of all, guys, if you don't have pigments, you can't afford pigments, don't sweat it. Honestly, you don't need pigments. Get a little bit of watered down white glue, something like this Scenic Cement, a tube of white craft glue, Weld Bond, anything like that. Mix it down to a milky consistency or a little bit heavier. Go out to the garden and grab some freaking dirt and mix it up. Back in the old days, I used to mix up black dirt and sawdust. That was my ground cover. That was my mud. You don't need to go out and spend, well, let's say, here's golf course sand, one of my favorite dried muds. This is $10. $10 Canadian. So you don't need that. You can go into a craft store and buy a 99-cent pastel stick, shave it down. The pigments and the colors aren't quite as vivid, but you know what? You don't need to spend the money. Alright, let me show you what I'm going to use. Okay guys, you know me, I'm always blathering about putting your model in context. It's the same thing when you're doing mud. You need to put your mud pigments in context. This is going to be in Chechnya. From what I've seen, the soil in Chechnya is very dark, thick, rich, black topsoil. So with that in mind, we can use a couple of different things. We can use one of my favorites, which is MIG number 34, which is Russian Earth. It's a nice, heavy, black topsoil. And with that also in mind, you can also use a Vallejo pigment. This is Natural Umber. It's also a nice, dark, rich topsoil. Couple different things you need to remember. If it's in a muddy environment, the odds are it's probably going to be in mud, so you may want to show a little bit of dried mud and a little bit of wet mud. So you're going to definitely show different contrasting colors. And let's face it, if you go through an area where it's more clay and then back into an area of more topsoil, you're going to have a different color mud. So boom, with that we can use a dark mud to represent a clay, and something like a Gulf War sand, which is going to really represent a good dried mud. If you're going to do something that's been through the mud but it's dried off and now it's in more of a dry conditions, use something like the Gulf War sand. It makes an excellent dried clay color. And let's say if you're over in Southeast Asia doing a Vietnamese diorama, you're definitely going to keep that in mind. The soil is going to be a lot redder, so you want to be able to maybe use something like a Vallejo burnt sienna. So keep in mind where you're operating and what you're going to try and represent what theater is it going to be in. So two separate ways we can do mud. Right here, this is yeah, that doesn't look good. It's a little it came with the Vallejo AK Interactive mud set. It's actually a powder of spackle, of wall compound, or plaster Paris. You can use something like that. Mix it up with some white glue, some Liquitex matte media. You can go that route and mix your pigment in there. Or you can do something like this Vallejo white pumice. You can use that as your mud media base and add your pigments to that. So what I'm going to start out with, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to use some of this as a heavy base, and then we're going to go over to the lighter stuff to do a lighter top coat of mud. So we'll get this mixed up. So somewhere in my travels I picked up a whole raft of these little mixing cups. They work like a dam. Butter knife. Please don't steal one out of your wife's kitchen. If you do, make sure you clean it up. Better yet, go to the value store or the thrift shop, buy yourself a couple of these, and keep them clean and keep them down here. So what we've got here is we're just going to mix up enough, what looks like to be, that's probably a little bit too much, just enough to do both sides. So this is going to be the heavier dried on mud that's going to be caked around the suspension. And keep in mind that the suspension moves, so you're going to want to have little areas where the mud's been rubbed off and maybe not quite as beat up as you'd want. So we're going to put that in our mixing cup, and we're going to throw a little bit of the matte media in it to act as a bonder, and just for ships and giggles, a tiny little bit of white glue, just to make darn good and sure. I like this weld bond, is good stuff, but it just takes so damn, the nozzles tend to get piled up on it. So we'll just take a little bit of weld bond. It's really a thick glue. So if that gets too thick for you, what you need to do is you can take some of this Woodland Scenic, which is a really watery glue, or you could just add water to that basically. But we're just going to add a little bit of this in there, just to give it a little bit more thinness. Alright, so what we need to do now, we're just going to mix this all up. You can hear the crunchy pumice in there. It is in fact pumice. I think this is basically the same stuff your wife's going to use to scrape her calluses on her feet. Yeah, that's the kind of consistency you want. Almost like whipped cream. A nice heavy whipped cream. Alright, now that doesn't look very good, does it? Nope. So this is where we add some of the pigments. So we're going to start with some of the Vallejo. And remember, if it still looks too pale, well, you know what? You can throw a little bit of Vallejo or Vallejo Model Air or Tamiya paint in there to thin it out a bit. Or you can actually, you see how much I use of that? Now this stuff's not cheap. So you see that? I ain't gonna cut her. So we're gonna have to throw some paint in there, guys. So I've added a little bit of Vallejo Surface Primer Black and Red Primer Brown, just to give it a little bit of color. This is just your base. Remember, this is going to be the heavier stuff. When you put this stuff on, you can put it into the road wheels where it's going to get, you know, in recessed areas. It's going to be back up under in here, back up in here, back here, along the back and the bottom. Now guys, remember one thing that's very important. Do not put any mud on the face of these wheels, because as this tank is driving, it's going to get squished out and put away. If anything else, you can put a corresponding wash over the face of the wheels, but do not get any mud on there, because quite honestly, it's not going to be there. Even on the face of the models, when you look at industrial equipment that's been out in the mud, which unfortunately I work around a lot in the mud, the faces generally are pretty clean and there's nothing on the tracks. It's all pushed out. So what we're going to start with, we'll just start with a little bit in here. Now you're thinking, "Ee, that's not a good mud color, dude." No, it isn't. It's a crappy mud color, actually. But we're going to fix that up afterwards. So what we're doing is basically just adding some texture where you'd have heavier mud. And if you put a stippling effect on, you can get a really nice textured look. Remember, don't get any on those road wheels. So I'm going to turn the camera off, go ahead, finish this texturing up, and then we'll show you the next step. And don't forget to do the underside of the fenders, because remember, that's where all the mud is going to be hitting first. So you want to just kind of schlump this on. Put some on the tip and on the nose of the fender. Put the edges here. Now remember, this isn't a one-shot deal, guys. Afterwards, you can go back and add and subtract. Well, it's hard to subtract. So you're better off, this stuff bonds pretty good. So you remember, you're better off to put this stuff on the first go a little bit lighter until you get the tracks and the everything else on. Then you can go a little bit heavier. The big thing is, what we're going here for now is just more mud texture as opposed to the coloring that it's going to be. Because quite honestly, that is just nasty color. Yeah, you'll lose a little bit of this stuff because it will be all dried up by the time you get ready to use it again. So, excuse the arm. Sorry guys, let me just get this. Look after your equipment, even look after your stuff. Even if you've got some old beat up brushes, make sure you're clean. Now, so what we're going to show first in the background is some little bit drier mud. So for that, we're going to use the Gulf War sand, and then we're going to work our way down. The top portions are going to be Gulf War sand, and then we're going to get down more into the Russian earth. Okay, here's a quick tip. When you're doing pigments, anything with pigments, put your model inside the box, the model box that it came with, to collect up any pigments. And I've got a separate pigment jar that just strictly has mixed pigments. So we've washed our brush out, we've dried it out. Now we're just going to start laying a little bit of, we're going to use dark mud, and we're going to start laying that on the top here. Remember, we're going for a multiple, kind of a multicolored look here. Don't worry about too much about putting pigments or mud, the mud mix, on the sprockets and return wheel, because generally speaking they're up a little higher, and you just don't see a lot of mud that generally climbs up there, although mud is insidious and it does tend to get everywhere. So that's the first go of that. So like I said, the first, we're going to use dark mud to simulate a more of a dried mud. So after that, we'll get down here with our Russian earth, which is a darker, much darker pigment that does look like, very much like thick, rich black topsoil. Which kind of looks like the soil around this area where I live. Really nice topsoil out here. and do all this. Yeah, you know what? You do tend to use a little bit more of this way, but you also get the colors that you want. So there you go, guys. Now you're going to want to let this dry off a bit, and we're going to use a little bit of wet effects afterwards on the back of the in some of the areas to make it look like it's wet. So that's it. Now let me finish up and we'll do the rest of it, and we'll give you a show on how that looks. Okay, this is not a science, this is messy, this is mucky, but you certainly get some nice mud on there. Now as you can see, we got all this expensive pigment sitting here. Last thing you want to do is throw it in the garbage. So that's why we just get her all in there. You don't want it in the garbage, and you don't want it all over your bench. So there's of all of our mixed pigments. So we just grab, I've got an old extra one here. It's not really, it's just a mix one. And you just go ahead and pour it in there. I'm finding I can find the damn thing. Must be this one right here. Oh, there it is. I got it already out, so I wouldn't have to go look for it. Just an old empty one. Just pour it in there. Now, quick word on pigments. A Vallejo you get is a better value. It's about the same price as MIG, but you do get about double the volume. You get twice as much Vallejo pigment for pretty much the same price, but it's not ground quite as fine, and the coloring's not quite as rich as the MIGs. So you do have a choice between the MIG and the Vallejo. Better value, honestly, much better value, but not as good a coloring, not as vivid of colors, and it doesn't tend to. It just doesn't give you the rich colors that the MIG does. So your choice, guys. I go with either one, whichever is cheaper and whatever I need. That's the one to use. All right, that's the first step in the mud process.